Oh, it's an ethic that is
Yeah.
horrid. Horrid. It's disgusting. It's appalling.
It was known that kings went off to war.
This is not war like the ancient Near East war. Someone is making these people a little kinder and gentler.
I think what he's doing is he's accommodating the context in which his people are and saying, ew, but let me step in and point you to something a little bit better.
Have you ever wondered how an all-loving, all-powerful God could command the Israelites to wipe out and destroy entire groups of people, including infants, children, women, elderly? Dr. Gordon Oeste and Dr. William Webb think they found an answer. How are you guys doing today? Can you give us a little bit about your background?
Go
You want
ahead.
to go first, Bill?
You go, Gordon. You go.
Sure. So I guess probably the most important thing you need to know about me is I'm a Canadian, eh? No. So I am married to Carolyn, actually. I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm married to Carolyn. Right now, I serve as the teaching pastor at Cedar Creek Community Church, and I'm also an adjunct professor at Tyndale Seminary, Tyndale University in Toronto, Canada. That's a really short snapshot. There's
Yeah,
Yeah, great job there.
that's the short list, Gordon.
Yes, that's the short version.
Yeah. Well, my claim to fame is I am a friend of Dr. Gord Oste, and it's been a great relationship. We worked together at one particular seminary, and we got fired together at one particular seminary, unnamed, and both of us are at Tyndale now, and loving it. And so I teach actually a full time load, but I don't want to go to any meetings, so I stay adjunct. But I have a kind of a hybrid relationship of sorts, and and I like staying at in Waterloo, not going in very often to campus. But they've been a great support for some of the incremental ethic ideas that we developed in this book and others, and so we're very thankful for what Tyndale Seminary has done
Yeah.
for many within the group of scholars there. Students are great. I'm on with a group of students later on after this, so have really enjoyed that. I have let's see, wife Marilyn and two living children. One passed away, two living children, and one's a lawyer in Toronto, and one is an exec on Meta slash Facebook down in California, who we're going to go visit next month, not only for the warmer weather, but also we have third grandchild on the way, a little baby girl. Yes.
Oh, man.
Okay, had to squeeze that in there, just in case Marilyn ever watches this.
Awesome. Yeah, you can show it to her when she's older. Uh, there you go. So, uh, bloody, brutal, and barbaric, wrestling with troubling war. That's your book. That's the book you wrote. Can you give us a summary of what you wrote about in it?
Well,
Starting with Dr. William Webb. Yeah, there you go.
a summary of what we wrote in it. Bloody, brutal, and barbaric. The title is somewhat bombastic, but it describes, I think, what we struggle with personally and what often Christians struggle with, let alone unbelievers, when they read scripture and they read texts where go kill them all, don't leave anyone standing, you know, wipe out everyone. No one, and then the reports come back. No one survived. Nothing. Not a breath of air was floating around. Not a breath of human air. That's pretty troubling, especially in an ethical scene today where genocide, let alone conquest wars, such as what we have going on in Europe, parts of the world today, we're taking territory for again, let alone killing all. I mean, all of these raise ethical questions. Is this the God we worship, and is this the God we want to worship? How can we sustain faith? It's one thing if we just narrowly look at Jesus, and Jesus just in certain gospel portraits, but once we look at the apocalyptic warrior Jesus and these Old Testament texts, then you go, how can I sustain a faith with that kind of? So that's kind of the impetus, and from that we worked through a series of theses or propositions, 4, 5, 6 propositions. Gord, you want to summarize the propositions? What we kind of argued across the board in a variety of areas?
Yeah, there's an. I'm not sure if I'm going to remember all of them.
Throw in a few.
So if I skip 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, you'll let me know, Bill.
You got to read the book.
Yeah, but certainly. By the way, I think we missed an opportunity with the title there. We could have added a 4th B there, but bloody, brutal, barbaric, and bombastic. But yeah. So there's a couple of key. I guess, assumptions or propositions that we look at. One of them is just kind of looking at some of the past answers to the question and past and current kind of answers to the question. And sometimes the questions that we ask and bring to the text aren't the ones that the biblical text is trying to answer. And so a lot of times our answers then don't really mesh well, and we get kind of square pegs in round holes. And so what we're trying to do by looking at what was the message in its original context, and I know that's a little bit of a focus for you, Zach, and your audience. We're trying to help put the square peg in the square hole and the round peg in the round hole when it comes to trying to put answers together well. Another kind of assumption that we make is that kind of goes hand in hand with that is that while God speaks to us, at times he accommodates his answers to where we're at. So, for example, when God, when humanity gets booted out of the Garden of Eden, his solution isn't right away, boom, okay, you're back in the new heavens and new earth. There's a slow progression towards the new heavens and new earth. And that's God accommodating us and our weakness and slowly moving us along, moving us towards, God's ideal, which we had in a version of Eden or in Eden. And now little by little, God's kind of moving us closer to the kind of ethic, the kind of life that he's called us to live, the kind of life he's made us to live. And so there's an element of accommodation in the way that God works. That's a key assumption. Another one is, for us, is hyperbole.
And I could add, Gord,
go ahead.
Key assumption, but also proposition. This is what we're arguing too. Yeah. Right. And then another one is we argue fairly vigorously. We devote, I think, 5 or 6 chapters to the idea that when the Bible says, especially some of the Old Testament texts in Joshua and a little bit in Judges, say, kill them all, leave no one alive. We argue that that's hyperbole, that's highly emotive, kind of over the top language in order to convey, a certain point. And so that's a key proposition. Refresh my memory, Bill. And a departure from the traditional view.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the traditional view and new atheism take the same literal approach. So we're hitting out on both sides.
Yeah. And so I think those are some of the core ones. Bill, is there a couple others that I missed?
Oh, a couple. Yeah. One is what we did with the genocide hyperbole hypothesis is simply to zero back to an ethical zero line with respect to the ancient, with respect to the ancient culture. What we're saying is all the ancient cultures did this, okay? And it wasn't really total kill hardly ever, but they talked in this kind of language. And we can give you some arguments for that. That's a fundamental one, but that just zeroes off in terms of, okay, Scripture was like many of the other cultures in terms of war language. But what we did in addition to that is to develop strong aspects of sample after sample of incremental movement, where something, shall we say, in a popular sense, funky is going on in the biblical text, where someone's playing with this and moving it redemptively, so that this is not war like the ancient Near East war. Someone is making these people a little kinder and gentler in their handling of a very vicious context of social life, obviously.
Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell notifications.
Wait, they have to subscribe and click a bell now?
Yeah, and that's part. If I can build on that for a sec, Bill, that's especially one of the things that we do is kind of look at the way that Israel fought its battles and fought its wars, and the descriptions that we have compared to ancient Near Eastern, contemporary-ish ancient Near Eastern cultures, and that's particularly where we see the movement, the difference between the way that other nations fought wars and the things that God is doing in Israel to kind of move it a little bit away from the vicious war ethic that we see in contemporary Israelite culture.
Well, yeah, in ancient contemporary Israelite culture, yeah.
Awesome.
Clarify that.
Yeah, that's all really great stuff. I'm excited to get into all that. Did you have something to say, Dr. Osteen?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right, sweet. All right. So yeah, you briefly talked about, like the square peg and the round hole, and how we understand how the context is really important to understanding the Bible. Can you talk about that briefly for my audience? They have a general understanding, but just for those that don't.
I can start. I can start with an example of why it's important and why we can't, or why we don't just kind of take why context really matters. So for example, if you go to Genesis 15, it's the story of Abraham, and he knows that God has promised him the land, but he's not sure how in the world this is going to happen, and he's promised him children. And so he's asking God and asking the question, how do I know this is really true? I'm paraphrasing a bit there, but you get the sense. And in answer to that, what God does, to us, just raises all kinds of questions. And we're going, what in the world is that all about? Because God has Abram kind of take a variety of animals, and either the larger ones cut them in two, or the smaller ones just kind of place them on one side or another of a walkway. And then the smoking fire pot passes through, and this is somehow a covenant. And for us, we're going, how in the world is this a guarantee and assurance for Abraham? But for Abraham, in his context, in his mindset, and in his worldview, that is a very strong, it's not just kind of like a nice, yes, don't worry, it'll happen kind of thing. This is one of the strongest ways that God could have communicated to Abraham, I'm good for this. I'm going to make it happen. And so, understanding the context, and we'd have to unpack it more, but that's not our focus here. But just unpacking the way that covenants worked, and the role that covenants worked, and how you sealed covenants in particular, is really, really important for understanding what God is saying there. Without that, if we're just kind of reading it, and today, without that background, it just kind of becomes this head scratcher where you're going, what's that all about? So I think that part of the reason why in our case, when we're looking at war and warfare in the biblical context, in the ancient biblical context, why understanding the way that things worked and understanding the way that people approach things then, as opposed to kind of our modern assumptions that we bring to the text, is really, really important for understanding what's going on back there. So I think that's a starting place for understanding and for the importance of understanding context. Is one example of why context matters so much.
For sure. Anything to add, Dr. Webb?
Yeah, and let's just steer it into the genocide texts and say why context matters there. Context matters there because if we take it literally, which is what I was raised on, that's the traditional view that we're countering. If you take it literally, well, then God literally did and wanted to wipe out everyone in the Canaanite nations. And what we've discovered is reading it within the ancient world context and reading the text more closely makes a good case that it's never to be taken literally. And if that's the case, that impacts ethics, it impacts faith, it impacts how we view God. And so we put on the table something called hyperbole. And sometimes Christians have struggled with that. They say, well, then God's not telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let me give an illustration about why God's telling the truth there. I'll let Gord talk about hockey in a minute, but I'm going to talk about my wife, Marilyn. And just the other day, she said to me, before I got a copy of this in the mail, she said to me, Bill, how come it's taken you forever to write that book? And I said, what? It's taken me forever to write that book? And I kind of chuckled. I said, are you using hyperbole? And she kind of smiled because she's read sections of it anyway. And I said, I would not dare say that my wife Marilyn was lying to me or was not truthful. It's that hyperbole is a figure of speech where we're impassioned about something or other. And so we don't only want to say X, we want to say X plus, because we're trying to say something with an emotive content to it. Now you have to figure out what the emotive content was or is in the context. I did a very dangerous thing and said to Marilyn, I know, I don't think you're saying that's a literal forever because that's a long time. It only took me 14 years. It only took Gord and I 14 years. Well, Gord helped me last 7 years, and we worked on it 7 years together. That's not forever. Come on. So, but I shan't say to Marilyn, "Oh, you're lying," or that's untruthful. Yeah, what you say is, what is the emotive content that you're trying to say to me by using forever, by using hyperbole? And then we had about an hour's discussion about what she was trying to say to me about using hyperbole. And that shall not go out on the air. That shall be sealed. I shall walk between animals, etc. Anyway, so once you sense within the literature of the ancient Near Eastern world, it's not, and you get over some of the hurdles of why they might be using a figure of speech, and certainly, Gord, there are other venues in which most people are familiar with. You want to jump in?
Yeah. The other thing I would add, and this kind of piggybacks on what you're saying, Bill, is a lot of times the critique that sometimes comes back from some circles is, well, how do if this is hyperbole, then everything, how can I trust anything, right? And the thing is, and you were alluding to this, Bill, we have to work hard to understand hyperbole. If you're new to a language, if you're new to a culture, it's really hard work. If you've been part of it for a while, you know how to interpret things a little bit more carefully and a little bit more fully because you're immersed in that culture and that situation. So one of the ways here in Canada, one of our passions here in Canada is hockey. And if you're watching if you're listening to, let's say, after the morning after a game, if you're listening to a sportscaster talk about a hockey game, you might say the New York Rangers annihilated the Toronto Maple Leafs 7-1. Now, we all know, because we're hockey fans here in Canada, we know, there aren't 6 bodies lying on the ice, and next game they're going to have to find 6 replacements, and they're going to stand in and try and play as well as they can. We know that not to interpret that literally. We know that means that the Rangers really gave a thumping to the Toronto Maple Leafs, and they were badly defeated. But then, in maybe a little bit later in a newscast or something like that, maybe 2 minutes later, a minute later, as you kick into the news and you hear that, troops in the Ukraine were annihilated by whoever, all of a sudden, because the context is different, we know how to, even though the words are the same, we know how to interpret those words, one as figurative, as a very over-the-top description of something that happened, and another one we know to interpret far more literally, and with, Canadian fans may grieve at a statement like that made when it's hockey, but we know it's hockey. It's, we know we can deal with that. But when it comes to human lives and things like that, and it's much more literal, because we know how to interpret that, we know a much deeper grief, right? And so hyperbole is even context specific, and we have to learn in which contexts it's being used and in which other ones it's not. Jesus at times will use hyperbole, but not all of the time, and we know how to interpret that. All of us on this live stream cast, all of us have our arms and legs, even though Jesus says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. And we know how to interpret that because we know Jesus means this is how seriously you need to take sin, but we don't interpret it literally. And so, there's context is important, and learning how to interpret in the varied context, especially when it comes to warfare, is really important.
So if we take that into the book, we work at 8 chapters within the book, and then 5 chapters online that are part of an appendices, arguing for the hyperbole hypothesis. And one of those chapters is hyperbole within ancient Near Eastern warfare. Okay, so that sets the external context, but then we argue the rest of the chapters within the biblical text itself and the evidence within the biblical text that also pushes that direction.
Awesome. All right. So let's go ahead and get into the example of the text, and then we'll talk about some maybe background context of the culture. So first, I wanted to start out with Deuteronomy 21:10-14, which is a really difficult passage for many. It reads, "When you go to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands, and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. Bring her into your home and have her shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothes she was wearing when captured. After she has lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you are not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her." So on face value, this looks like God is commanding a bunch of people to go kill a bunch of men and then take their wives for, honestly, it looks to be like for some type of sexual pleasure. Can you talk to us about how you interpret this passage concerning how it looks to be kind of gross, but supposedly God's supposed to be awesome and a really loving God. How does that work?
Why don't you do that one, Bill?
Oh, it's an ethic that is
Yeah.
horrid. It's disgusting. It's appalling. And there's no way around saying that this is a terrible treatment of women. And especially when you're looking at it from a contemporary context, where at least in a Canadian culture, we've come, quite far in terms of affirming egalitarian rights and roles in society and all the things that come as part of that, right down to paid leave for women giving birth and raising kids and that kind of thing, and when you get to divorce, this text talks about divorce. It's an equal split. There's no messing around unless you have some kind of prenup agreement. So you read a text like this from our contemporary context, and you go, "Ooh, yuck, that's our God," and you really wrestle with it. But let's get immersed in the ancient Near Eastern world and what happened to women. Okay, and Greco-Roman, we have even more evidence. The ancient Near Eastern world, we have less evidence. Greco-Roman world, they put war rape on their coins. They put war rape, on in their poetry, and there was that was also pervasive within the ancient world. War rape that happened on the battlefield. So
especially after siege warfare.
Yeah. So especially after siege war, but rape on the battlefield, you knock off the men, they flee, and vulnerable women are left. And guess what? That's some of the payoff. And so you see that, and then they hire artisans, more so in the Greco context, but still some in the A&E context. And it's assumed, and yet that does not go down. Battlefield rape does not go down in the ancient Near Eastern biblical context. All of a sudden, you start hearing something different, because Israel, when it goes out to war, must take the Ark of the Covenant with them. And having the Ark of the Covenant with them out on the battlefield means that they can't even involve themselves in marital sex, let alone war rape. It was the Ark of the Covenant also within the temple made it sacrosanct that sex was not part of Yahwistic worship, unlike what I think what was going on in other ancient Eastern temples, as well as Greco-Roman temples, where the involvement in sexual expression was brought in. Well, so here something's happening in terms of, no, you're not permitted battlefield rape. In fact, you got to sustain from any sexuality for that time because of your proximity to the Ark of the Covenant. They had heightened sanctions there, and so all of a sudden you're having this army that isn't ravishing women, and you get one back to the land, and okay, you're attracted to her, boom, 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 boom. And I kind of wish the text would read, "You're attracted to her," and you look over there, and what do you see? But she's reading a Hebrew Bible, and you go over and you have a great conversation with her, and she has this faith in Yahweh, and you get to know her, and you become great sparring partners, and enjoy each other's company. No, you don't get any of that. But what you do get is is at least no battlefield rape, and you have to wait 30 days. Okay. Now, that could have been for menstrual cycles to see whether or not they're pregnant, blah, 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 blah. But we argue the case that that's not primary, but it might be tertiary or secondary. But primarily, it is concern for mourning and grief, as the text actually states. That, okay. In other warfare, if you're permitted to do the kinds of things that went on in ancient Eastern warfare and Greco-Roman warfare on the battlefield in terms of battlefield rape, you could do whatever the heck you wanted back home. You could take them, and many were sold into temple slavery, temple prostitution. They became concubines, and you could hire out your concubine to other people because you were given some women to service, and you could. And here, you had to wait 30 days, and then you had to marry her. There's actually covenant language in there. And if you divorce her, you cannot sell her as a slave. Now that's the bomb, because that's the first thing you would do is either I'll turn her into a concubine and I'll hire her out, or I'll sell her as a slave. No, she goes free. Okay. Now that something is going on relative to the ancient world. Yes, from our contemporary egalitarian culture, we go, ooh, yuck, I'm just about sick to the stomach reading that. But when we read it within the ancient Eastern context, we hear something different. And we have to understand that God is moving incrementally. I love that word, incremental movement towards something more redemptive. But it's going 10 yards, 20 yards down the field. It's not going all the way to the goal line. That would force God to turn this into a new heavens, new earth. Okay, but he is pulling his people along, even in these very grievous texts. And I want to get back to some other examples later on that, but I'll quiet down here. I can get excited about that. Sorry.
I think, let me clarify that. We can get excited about the redemptive elements that we see, where God is at work, in this ancient culture, and saying, no. Okay, we're going to put boundaries around what you can do, and we're going to move you a little bit more. We're going to move you away from that that pervasive war culture, and move you some steps further down the road towards something a little healthier.
Yeah, for sure. And that'll be really interesting to talk about that redemptive movement that God is taking the Israelites through. So the next text we're going to talk about is Deuteronomy 7:1-2. And I mean, it seems like God is commanding the Israelites to wipe out a bunch of people in a very not nice way. So let's read that. So when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. And we also have Deuteronomy 7:16, 23-24, and 20:16-18. And I mean, it seems like just what we expect, from, essentially any other God, where you have a people using a God to get what they want, is just, conquer and take things. And, it doesn't seem like the very loving God, and some people would say the loving God of the New Testament. So can you talk about how you understand these passages, given that, God seems to be loving, but is also telling people to kill people?
Yeah. When you hear that, it just makes you go, oh man, what in the world is going on there? I think, maybe a place to start, Zach, I don't know if you have So when you read verses 1 and 2, for sure, it says, kill everybody, leave no one alive, show them no mercy even. That's kind of the language that's used there. But if you keep reading, and I don't know if you have verses 3 and chapter 7, verses 3 and 4 in front of you. If you don't, that's not a problem. But if you do you mind reading verses 3 and 4? Oh, you're just calling it up. Sorry.
Oh, you're totally fine. Here you go. All right, we got 3 and 4. Okay, yeah. So it says, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to make sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will completely destroy you. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Okay. So right there, I think there's that one little clue. There's more to unpack, but there's one little clue right there that the intent of the passage isn't complete annihilation, because if Israel does verses 1 and 2, then you don't need verses 3 and 4. So if Israel wipes everybody out, there's nobody left. The command not to intermarry with the Canaanites really doesn't have. You don't need it at all. And so, at the very least, you kind of going, okay. There's something else going on here other than just a literal, wipe them all out kind of thing. If you take that just really quickly to go to the ancient Near Eastern context, and you take that, and if you go, well, let me start first with Joshua and then go to the ancient Near Eastern context. When you read Joshua, it certainly seems like Joshua does exactly what Moses and God seem to be saying, because there's numerous passages you get the story of Jericho in Joshua 6. You get the story of Ai in the next chapters in 7 and 8. In chapter 10, you get this litany of all of these conquests that Israel goes through in the southern part of Israel. And again, you hear this. They conquered and they left no one alive. They conquered and they left no one alive. And it's repeated repeatedly. It's repeated several times in Joshua 10. So at first glance, it seems like that's exactly what's going on. But then you read a little bit more closely. You kind of give it a second or maybe a third read. And one of the people who's been really, really helpful in putting this in, kind of to put it into an ancient Near Eastern context and kind of start the ball rolling in that direction, was a scholar at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School by the name of Kay Lawson Younger. And then there's been a whole bunch of other people that have kind of built off of his work, and we do much the same. But certainly kings and polities back then wanted to let you know just how fearsome and how powerful they were. And so quite often they would use that "we wiped them all out, left no one alive" kind of language. When you get to the biblical text, you see there's some clues even within the biblical text that the language of total kill isn't exactly what's going on. So for example, when you go to Joshua chapter 10, we're told that Joshua completely wiped out everybody in the city of Gaza. But then you go to the very next chapter, and there's more conquering that needs to happen in the city of Gaza. Okay, that's like a one chapter away kind of thing. We're told, for example, that Joshua in Joshua 10, that Joshua and the Israelites completely annihilated the city of Debir. But then you go on to chapter 15, and there you read about how Caleb needs to conquer the city of Debir again. And you're going, wait a minute, what are all these people doing here? You can keep going, and there's other examples of that. When you get to the book of when you get to the book, to the end of the book of Joshua, it sounds like, even though you've got these passages that say, wait a minute, there's more conquering that still needed to happen, it sounds like we conquered the whole land. So how do you put those two together? There's more conquering that needs to happen, but we conquered the whole land. Well, hyperbole seems to be the answer that fits that and more quite well in, as we try to argue, or I think as we do end up arguing well. See that ancient Near Eastern kings, when they would trumpet all over the place how they killed everybody and left no one alive, and yet we know from historical records and other evidence that actually there are still survivors. Sometimes, and the kings will even acknowledge it at times, a sentence or two later, that when the survivors actually get to here, send them to the temple, kind of thing. And so for us, and that in Joshua is just kind of one example. We see it where this language of hyperbole, where we kind of go, how do we put those together? Well, hyperbole seems to be the best answer. And so the other places where we see it, for example, are God says to Israel a number of times, both in the Pentateuch and even in the prophet Jeremiah, that if you stray, if you do the same kind of things that the Canaanites do, then I'm going to wipe you out as well.
And the language is every, young and old, male and female, and it is completely inclusive, and just like the Joshua stuff. And this is God saying, I'm going to do this. Yeah. And when I take you into exile, there's nobody good to go into exile, because you're going to get all wiped out in war. Yeah. Well, that's not true. A significant part of the nation went into exile, and a significant part of the nation came back.
Yeah. A really clear example of that is in Jeremiah 25, verse 9, where God says he's going to destroy the city of Jerusalem. And the word that's used there is the same word that's used throughout the Joshua passages for wiping everybody out. And he says he's going to wipe out the city of Jerusalem using the king of Babylon. But we know from both the biblical text and from history that the city of Jerusalem isn't wiped out, that there are still lots of people that are left alive, plenty to go into exile or plenty to continue to live there. So there's a variety of different examples that signal there's hyperbole going on here, so that not everybody was wiped out, not everybody was killed. In fact, typically it was the king, some of maybe the key people in a city, and maybe some of the combatants, and that sort of thing. Possibly some collateral, other people were killed, but primarily the king and the people closest to the king. Those are the key ones that in any battle you want to defeat, because those are the ones that become, later on, they're the ones that would be your main opposition.
Wow, that's really interesting. Okay, so just to go even more detail about, how even, I guess, I don't want to say gross, but how gross it could be. Deuteronomy 32:25 says, "And the sword will make them childless, and their homes terror will reign. The young men and young women will perish, the infants and those with gray hair." So, I mean, it's going into great detail about how, like, you're killing everybody, but that seems to kind of go against the idea that it's hyperbole. Like, how can you kill everybody? Like, why in the world would you even go into great detail like that if it is hyperbole? Can you talk about that?
Well, primarily for the emotive value, and that is it's a particular kind of genre. It's a war genre, and we catalog in the prophets, because reverse holy war happens in the prophets, where God takes, as we were just talking about, and all through the prophets we catalog about 20 cases of texts where it's talking all of these specifics the prophets are saying, and the old and the young, and the male and the female, and the rich and the poor, and the, all of society, and the virgins will not marry, and the sounds of music will not continue, and you realize that it's saying something emotively that don't become like the Canaanites who God expelled from the land for the same reason that you're now getting expelled from the land. Israel becomes the new Canaanites. Okay, and God doesn't treat them any differently. He uses ancient Near Eastern warfare to expel his people. Now, if we can we just turn the road a little bit towards why I still hear God in these texts, and why I can believe in God,
Mm-hmm.
and a compassionate God and a loving God within these texts. And it is this incremental movement. It is this God is doing something with the hearts of his people, so that, for example, when in the ancient Near Eastern text, when you capture the city and you capture the king, you do horrendous things. There are all kinds of artwork where they chop off limbs and they cauterize the limbs so they don't bleed out, and they impale them. Is a precursor to the cross. Actually, they impale them and they stay alive in pain for 3 or 4 days, and that's how you especially treat the king and those who might rule next. So you want to get that group, and you do it publicly in public display, and you do all kinds of horrendous things to them. And what does Israel do? No, none of that. And we do a whole chapter on it's like a museum piece of ancient warfare, torture and torment. Yeah. And it is sickening. I had to stop writing that for about 6 months because I was getting dreams. I was waking up with these images, and they would stake people. I used to have a picture in the corner of my office. I took it down. They stake people down, and they skin them alive. They peel the skin off, so they're spread all fours, staked to the ground, and they peel the skin off, and they take that skin and they make it into furniture for the vestibules and of the palaces of the great Sennacheribs and other rulers, and Israel, to the king, to the one who is the most hated of the foreign group that you're warring against. Once he's dead, you kill with a sword. Once he's dead, then you put him up so that people can see, like, we've got your king. But you don't torture, and you bury him. You bury him.
And for how long, Bill?
What's that?
How long do you put him up?
Just till sunset.
Yeah.
And you bury him at sunset, so the animals can't come along and eat the body of those kinds. And so part of that chapter is looking at how they treat the dead bodies, and they would come back to the conquerors and make the live captives dig up their dead bodies of their relatives, or they would have them grind their relatives into dust, that was psychologically in all of the this horrid kind of war stuff is stopped, and the treatment of the most the greatest offender, the king, is you give him a burial and you put him in the ground, and you're going, whoa, in an ancient Near Eastern context, no, this God is strange if this is connected to a God. This is too weird. I'll give one more if I can. Can you give one more redemptive moment?
Yeah, go for it, please.
I love this one.
I think there's so many more in Bill.
Oh, I know. Well,
I'm surprised you're going to stop with one.
Yeah, we itemized a whole pile of it. Well, I love this one because I never got taught this in Sunday school, and we call it David's bloody hands. Okay, And because I got taught in Sunday school that, the only thing wrong with David is the Bathsheba thing. But other than that, he was, David is the Jesus of the Old Testament. Well, we get a slightly different picture in Chronicles, and there's good reason for that. Chronicles is a good way to read the Bible, as Pete Enns and others have popularized well, is to read it backwards. And to realize that in the exile and post-exilic community, they're wrestling with how in the world did we get here? And so Chronicles is a rewriting of 1st and 2nd Kings during that time, and they rewrite David. And they rewrite David to say why it was that God did not permit him to build the temple, and instead had the Shalom boy, the peace guy, build the temple. David's bloody hands, because he fought many wars and he shed much blood, and he's getting smacked on the hand and not allowed to build a temple. Well, we read that and we go, oh, okay, well, he got some time off. But that's not an ancient Near Eastern world. 3 words in an ancient Near Eastern world: battle, build, boast. There, my fingers are in this. Battle, build, boast. The great warrior king is a successful battler, and he takes back the spoils of battle and he builds a temple for his God. That's the pattern of the ancient Near Eastern world. And in that temple, that God, in the ancient Near Eastern temple, time after time, you have, in fact, you can go to Egypt, and I visited some of these temples. You go in, and like Ramses, it's all war stuff. And they're popularizing the chariots, which is another thing. God said, get those out of he didn't want weapons of mass destruction. Another funky thing. No chariots, the weapons of mass destruction, and no war horses, etc. No, don't do that. Well, Solomon goes and does it anyway. But here, battle, build, boast. You're a big king. You're expected to. You honored your God, and you boasted about the victory on the walls of the temple. And all of a sudden, God comes out. I don't want you touching my temple, David, because you spread much blood. And all of a sudden, and all of a sudden we see, there's another side to this story. And Yahweh did not like some of this war stuff that went on. In fact, I would say a lot of it. Imagine going up to church and finding a painting, a pile of hands cut off, and they're on the wall of the church coming up. Well, that's what the temples were like. Sometimes they were quite explicit. There's one of penises and genitals and everything, a pile. Okay, and the warrior chariots and people being impaled on posts, etc. And the glory of war. And what happens in Yahweh's temple, Gord?
Yeah, it's like this is, as you're worshiping your God, these are the images that you're bombarded with all the time, and it's this war saturated culture, right? And so when you contrast that to the picture of the temple in Jerusalem, what's the iconography that you get? Palm trees, pomegranates, geometrical figures. It's this basically the inside. It's flowers. It's the inside. All of the pictures inside the temple are meant to be Edenic pictures, to take you back to the Garden of Eden, not the world with its war saturated culture. It's the journey back into Eden. And so the contrast for us, when we were kind of working this through, the contrast between the biblical culture and the biblical God, and the temple is kind of the the fullest expression at that time of who God is and what he values. It's completely opposite to the cultures in which Israel found itself. And that's
Yeah.
right from the very beginning. Like, you look at creation stories, the creation stories set the tone for everything else that follow, because they answer some of the big questions. Who are we? What are we about? Why are we here? The ancient Near Eastern stories are about war and creation through battle, where Marduk battles Tiamat. He cuts open her body, and half of her body he uses to create the earth, the other half becomes the sky. And there's all of this battle imagery right from the very beginning at creation. And what do you get in Genesis 1? And God said, and it was. And God said, and it was. Right? So different. And we found so many different elements. Some of them are in the book. And then, as Bill said, some of them we've included in an online appendix, just because we couldn't, we didn't want to make it. It's already a really long book. We didn't want to make it totally unreadable. So there's more to be had than kind of what we found, or we just put in the book.
Just to reiterate the David's Blade hand, that's where Yahweh is saying, I resonate with shalom, and I want shalom man to build my temple, because that's my core value. It's like the movement in the sacrifices, reparation, purification, birth, grain, shalomim. The shalomim is where we're headed. And that's the core element in all the life-giving aspects of the temple. All of a sudden, to have a God say, no, I don't want my great warrior to build me a temple and to celebrate me in battle.
Yeah.
Like what kind of
paradigm
God is this Yahweh God? And all of a sudden I think, okay, there's something going on here in the undercurrent that is maybe faith-worthy.
And Bill, do you want?
Yeah.
Sorry, Zach. I'm just wondering, Bill. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how that eases the, because for some people there's like kind of you get to the end of the Old Testament and it's kind of like a hard stop, and then we get Jesus, but we didn't see that hard stop at all. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, or.
Yeah, no, I think actually I'm meeting with my apocalyptic students. So if we go too late here, I'm going to shave time off them. And we're going to be into the apocalyptic Jesus warrior. And to cite a dear friend, Tremper Longman, I think he's changed his views. I can't speak for him, but I cited him in the book to say, to paraphrase, get over all the bloodiness in the Old Testament. The Jesus of the New Testament is just as bloody, if not bloodier, than the Yahwistic God of the Old Testament. And I'm going, Tremper. No, that's a literal reading, not a hyperbolic reading, let alone missing the incremental movement aspect. And we need to rethink what's going on in the apocalyptic scene. So I write a chapter where I say this is not literal, and it's got its apocalyptic literature has its own hyperbolic built in. Everything is monsters and everything. And it's saying something very valuable, but we ought to think through what the theology is. And so, yes, I think that the Jesus story takes it further and takes it to a profound and confident solution, particularly at the judgment seat of Christ, where I would argue that he will undo any wrongs over the past history and especially redemptive history.
Yeah.
And with that, cool. I just about got to finish up, guys. I'm looking at the time.
Yeah, sure. Right before you go, though, I do want to give everyone a way to access your other material. So could you talk about, I guess, previous books, just really short, obviously you don't have a lot of time, previous books that you've written? Like, I guess I would assume you guys have some type of website that you could go to that other people could check out your work.
Most of my stuff is on the Tyndale University, Toronto, Ontario, and the seminary side. My ugly portrait is there, as well as Gord's beautiful face. So, and some of our stuff is cataloged under there.
Yeah, it's probably the
Cool.
easiest place to do that. You can find our book on Amazon. You can go to IVP. Is it IV InterVarsity Press? So IVPpress, I think, .com. And if you look for Bloody, Brutal, and Barbaric, you can find that book there, and that'll take you to the stuff.
Awesome. All right, and you also have some other really great books. I definitely recommend those. Bill, I know you had to go. Dr. Oeste, do you have time for one more question for me?
Sure, I've got time for one more question.
Okay, cool. All right. You can go ahead and go, Dr. Webb.
Listen, say whatever you like, Gord. I trust you, and he's a good guy.
You guys talked about, you mentioned the word collateral, and I didn't know if that was in the context of what the other nations did or the context of what you thought the Israelites did. So, you said that it's hyperbole that, God told them to go kill the children and women. Do you think that literally like all of that women, children, old people that they went to go kill, that was just hyperbole? Or do you actually think that God was commanding any of them to die?
Yeah, we argue that language, especially of, young and old, male and female, and that those are what are called merisms, and they're literary ways of, I suppose, a version of hyperbole, or another literary way of saying, kind of saying everybody without actually spelling it out. So, if we say, I don't know, I'll use a different example, but at my church, all of the old men and the young men went to the basketball game. When I say that, in that kind of a context, it's a reference to not just all of the old men and all of the really young men, but and all the middle-aged men. None of them ever went. It's a way of saying, kind of referring to the top end and the bottom end, and saying everything in between. And so when we get to the biblical text, when it's saying young and old, male and female, and that, those are merisms. And again, they're literary expressions rather than literal expressions. And they're meant to be, it's part of that same kind of language, kill them all. It's a version of that that's being used there. And so in our view, did people die as a result of the battles that happened in the land of Canaan? Yes. And again, like we said, most likely we know the king died. Probably some key leaders in the city, probably some, but we don't know all. How many of the combatants died, how many of the soldiers died. Is it possible that some others died in that process? Quite possible, but there were lots of people that seemed to be left alive afterwards, enough that entire populations could still come and be living in the land. Even, for example, even during the time of probably the clearest one is the Jebusites. It's a city, the inhabitants of the city of Jebus, or what later became Jerusalem, right? Rather than conquering the whole city, we're told in Judges that the Israelites conquered the city at one point, but in reality, it continues to exist until not just the time of Samuel, not just the time of King Saul, but until the time of David, when David eventually conquers the city and kind of ends up taking it and eventually making it his capital city. But until then, you've got this Canaanite enclave living in the midst of the Israelites. And there's a few other passages once you get even into the book of Kings, which suggest that the Canaanites continued to live amongst the Israelites. So were there, how many people were killed? We don't know. We can't put exact numbers on it, but again, probably in all likelihood, the king, some key leaders in the city, combatants, possibly some non-combatants, but we don't know for sure.
I hate to say this, but like, it seems like immoral for people for God to command something where He knew that anyone that was like, in that innocent group of women and children would die. Do you feel that? And like, it's almost like if we say that there are some that ended up dying, that doesn't completely get God off the hook. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. It's in part the question is, okay, why doesn't God just do it a different way, right? Why use warfare at all? And it comes back, I think, a little bit to that incremental ethic where God's kind of putting borders around it and saying, okay, I know you live in a war saturated culture where every spring, it was known that kings went off to war, as we read, with King David, that springtime was the annual time for everybody to go to battle, kind of thing. And God says, no, we're going to put boundaries around this. And does he completely say no war whatsoever? No. There are wars that happen, but I don't want to. Yeah. So I think what God's doing is, it doesn't get God off the hook per se, but God is moving redemptively in the midst of His people, and He's accommodating. I think what He's doing is He's accommodating the context in which His people are, and saying, ew, but let me step in and point you to something a little bit better, and then a little bit better, a little bit further on, and then a little bit better, even further on. So yeah, it doesn't get God completely off the hook, but it's because He's accommodating Israel and Israel's context.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's too bad we couldn't talk more about the more redemptive passages. Those were really interesting, and I'm sure people will love to hear that, and they'll be happy to check out the book in that case too. So,
Yeah.
yeah, thanks for coming on here, Dr. Oeste. I hope you have a great rest of your night, and I really appreciate it. This has been a really great stream here.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for giving us a chance to talk about something that we're very passionate about.
Awesome. Yes, no problem.